Hi, I'm Sarah back again. This time I want to talk about the evolution of the Incandescent book, soon-to-be series. So in this video I'm going to be going through the many stages that the story went through, from its first draft all the way until its final draft when it was published last year in 2022. It's a funny story, as some of you might have already known. The first draft of what would eventually become Incandescent Magic Unknown was born out of spite to my sister. When we were really little, my sister and I shared our own computer. We had 3 computers in the house. My brother had his own, my parents shared one, and my sister and I shared one. This was like back in the old days of like one big fat monitor and a tower that took up half the desk, right? So, long time ago, there weren't many things to do on the computer. I mean, we had dial-up internet. There wasn't much to really do back then. We would use Microsoft Paint and make little squigglies, but like, aside from that, there wasn't actually much to do, but I still wanted to use it. So my sister and I were sharing it, and she was taking up a lot of the time using the computer, so I needed an excuse to use the computer. I needed something that I could justify taking time back from her. So I just started writing the story. There was no plot. There was no like idea going into it. It was just word vomit. I just spewed out this story, and it was dreadful. Honestly, there is not much that's still recognizable from that first draft to what Incandescent Magic Unknown is now. Kurt was still the love interest. Larson and Cade were still his friends. There was a bad guy that was coming after them. That's kind of about it. There really wasn't much substance to it. It was, as I've mentioned, word vomit. And I finished the first book, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll just write a sequel. So I just wrote a second one, and then a third one. Not too long after the completion of the incoherent, rambling trilogy, I was in Europe for 2 months, and so I bought a giant notebook. I took those 3 ramblings, I cleaned it up, and I condensed it, and I wrote draft number 2. And it took 3 notebooks total. The pages were falling out. It was in very rough shape, both physically and intellectually. And again, not much that's still recognizable between that version and where it is now. Back then, Chris was actually named Nyla. In the very first draft, I had her as 19 years old, and then I promptly changed it to 14 years old, which her age just kind of continued to fluctuate as the drafts went on. She was also originally a reincarnated ex-girlfriend of Kurt's named Tanya, and Kurt was actually the one responsible for reincarnating her. And I realized after writing that draft that the timelines weren't adding up, because Kurt would have had to have been so many years older than her to reincarnate her, and it was messy. I did not understand. I clearly did not understand what it was I was trying to do. She was also a lot more passive and kind of a passenger role in her own story, like a damsel in distress, and it wasn't interesting. As mentioned, there was no real plot or driving force other than Tynan, who at the time was called Butch, because apparently that was the most intimidating name that I could think of, was Butch. And he was inexplicably continuously trying to kill Kurt. For no reason. No real reason. I also had a love triangle at that time, because as a young, insecure preteen who wanted to appear and feel desirable to the boys, it was a way to live vicariously, putting a character who was an empty shell, essentially, in a love triangle where 2 different people, well, honestly, a lot more people, because Larson and Cade also had a thing for her in this version. Pretty much I made every guy infatuated with her because I think I was trying to feel better about myself, I don't know. But she was in a love triangle with Kurt and another character named Brian, who was actually Tynan's son. Instead of a Mina ring being like one powerful weapon, but not really, spoilers, the characters had these ancient charms called the Goldenry charms, and they possessed elemental powers. So there was a water charm, a fire charm, thunder charm, things like that, so that it enhanced elemental powers in each of the characters, but it also left them susceptible to mind control and manipulation. Don't ask me why, it didn't make sense, but it was what I thought was interesting, I guess. It's like a with great power you also leave yourself very vulnerable kind of thing. And I cannot stress enough, these drafts were not good. There's a reason there's not much that has been really taken from them. Years later, I decided to revisit the story, and I started from scratch with my third draft. Third time's the charm, right? No, it was not. It was better, but it was not the charm. I changed the charms to instead be weapons that were used as keys to unlock Calisant. As previously mentioned, Chris's age just kept fluctuating. As I kept getting older, I kept changing her age to try to line up with my own, because I thought maybe I would be able to identify more, and it just read as very inconsistent across the board. I removed Brian's character altogether and instead introduced a new character who would eventually become Shay, and I took a lot of inspiration from Gambit from X-Men, because he is my favorite superhero, and so Shay had kind of that nonchalant, careless attitude where, again, he was interested in Chris because he liked that she kind of like pushed back and would fight, and he liked that feisty side of her. But Chris had no interest in him romantically. So I was trying to build, not necessarily a love triangle, but building up to that cliche misunderstanding trope that should be forgotten by Tollywood and books all over. Years later, when I came back to do the final draft, I removed this romantic element from Shay's character because he was a little bit older and it was just reading as kind of gross. And I liked him as a character and I thought I could do better with him. In this third draft, Kurt was so boring. He was so boring that I didn't like him. I didn't like him as a character. He was whiny and simpy, and his sole purpose was to love Chris. Like, quite literally, that was the only thing that he was good for, was to protect and love Chris. And that's not enough to build a character on. You don't really root for him. It's very bland. I didn't find myself invested in Kurt. I took actually a lot more interest in characters like Larson, and especially in Cade, and there was no real urgency to the story either. Like, nothing was actually driving it forward, and that was one of the biggest plot holes I found why I had to rewrite the story again, was that there was no real reason for the characters to go to Calisant. There was nothing to make them go do it. There was no reason why they couldn't just avoid Tynan altogether. So, a few years later, draft number 4. I started again, completely from scratch, and I was finally ready to nail down this story. I had new inspiration, and I was ready. Now, Chris was a reincarnated goddess, or at least a big, powerful figure in the Witkin lore, which I also changed from the early drafts where it was witches and warlocks, and I didn't want to stick to those and be confined to those definitions and ideals, especially because some people do actually practice witchcraft. I instead created my own race, sort of, and called it Wiccans, which I later changed to Witkins, because I didn't want to have confusion either with the Wicca group, because I know that that is also a current group of practicing individuals, and I didn't want to insult or be derivative or demeaning or create any kind of cultural appropriation to them. So I changed it to Witkins instead, so it's kind of a cross of Wiccan and witch. Haha, see what I did there? So anyway, I changed Chris to being this reincarnation of Anona, who is this big, powerful goddess protector of Calisant. And now, instead of weapons, I changed the keys now to be items that belonged to the lords and ladies of Calisant, so there were ancient items as opposed to physical weapons for fighting, because it didn't make sense to have physical weapons for fighting when they have magic. They're not really, fighting with swords, they're fighting with beams and fireballs. I was also using the ancient items to kind of be a reflection of each of the 5 main characters, and I'll touch on that in more detail in another video later on. So make sure you subscribe to see that video when it comes out. By far, probably the biggest transformation in this final draft, though, was Kurt. I finally made him a character that I found engaging and interesting, and most of the inspiration came about from 2 things. 1, The Last of Us, which, if you can't tell from from my lovely shelf back here, I am obsessed with The Last of Us. And 2, William Reinke's EPs. He released 2 of them, 13 and Virtue. They were beautiful and moving and unique, and it sparked something in me, and it breathed life into Kurt, and I took a lot of the emotion that I was pulling from those EPs, from those songs, this very somber feeling, and I tied that to Kurt and both his music ability, his music creation, and then also his character as well. And I took also the development of the relationship between Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us and kind of tied that into Kurt and Chris, in that he has a reluctance to care about her, but that he still does, and he's protective, and it's just this growing, budding relationship between the two of them, but more in a romantic sense rather than a father-daughter sense. I also made a commitment in this draft to make sure that each of my main characters, the 5 main characters, as well as my antagonist, Tynan, that they were each given their own full story to tell. I didn't want anyone to feel like they could have been plucked out and the story would have gone on the exact same way. So finally I had this last draft, at least this last version, and I was ready to move forward. I was finally ready to go through the steps of professional editing and publishing. I was terrified, but excited, exhilarated. I was so very ready to move forward. As you can see how many years and how many different drafts and how much work, blood, sweat, and tears I poured into this thing. I was finally ready. I was finally feeling so proud of my own work. So I took a whole week off of work prior to sending it to my editor, and I read through everything. I made changes. I removed subplots that just felt clunky and unnecessary. I tidied it up. I did my own spelling and grammar checks because I know that there's a lot of those errors in there. I also spent an hour on the phone with my sister, who finally read that draft. She was the only person who read the entire story before publication. And we spent an hour on the phone talking about a few key details, places where maybe you should do this instead, and here's a little note for this section. So I took everything that she said and I was able to make corrections, and I'm so grateful that I had that, because I feel like it helped with some of the pacing issues I had in the middle of the book where it wasn't enough driving it forward. So I'm so incredibly grateful for my sister being able to do that, and it's just amazing that it came around full circle like that. And my sister was the beginning and then the end of this story. That she was the reason I wrote it in the first place, and she was there at the end helping me perfect it. So I cannot thank my sister enough. She is my hero, and I love her. Jillian, if you're watching, I love you. So it was finally off to the editor and then went through the publication process, but it has been such an incredibly fulfilling feeling to reflect back on this long road I went through to get here, and I'm incredibly proud of myself for never giving up, even when those drafts were absolutely terrible and there was nothing to work with. I pulled what I loved all the way through. I took the things that I found interest in, and the themes still ring true. It's still very much a story about friendship and family and love, and I'm so proud of myself, and I don't say that very much. I'm also very grateful to all of you for any way that you helped contribute, whether it was me bouncing ideas off you in the past or contributing to my GoFundMe a year and a half ago to raise money for the publishing costs, because that was expensive, or even just reading my book, just buying and reading my book, telling people about my book, coming to this channel, watching my videos. I appreciate it so very much. I could not do this without you guys. But that's all for today. Make sure that you do subscribe to this channel, as I've mentioned a few things that I'm going to talk about in future videos. I do have a lot more ideas to come. And if you did enjoy this video, make sure to click that like button. It really helps me, gives me that boost of confidence to get out of bed in the morning. And if you have any ideas for anything else that you would like to see, leave a comment down below and let me know, because I would love to cater this better to you guys. That's all for now, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!